Welcome to Behind the Page, the Eli Marks podcast, with your hosts, John Gaspard and me, Jim Cunningham.
Jim.
Jono, hello.
Hello.
It seems like forever, but it was really just a week or so.
It's only been a couple of weeks since episode 416, but it does feel like a while.
It really does.
I miss our chats.
I do too.
As contentious and ugly and violent as they may get, I do miss them.
Are you thinking of me right now, or?
No, I'm sorry. I'm mistaking you for someone else.
Absolutely.
We are in episode 4. I'm sorry. This is season 4, episode 17, rolling right along. And this time we get to chat with someone that we really should have chatted with a long time ago, Jamy Ian Swiss. And I blame myself entirely for that because I find him a little intimidating. As it turns out, he's not, just like you find with Max Maven, wasn't really intimidating when you sat down with him. And it, in fact, was quite warm and surprisingly warm, as was Jamy Ian Swiss. But, he's one of these really intelligent magicians who can argue a point and speak definitively. And although he was one of the very first magicians I was exposed to when I started the Eli Marks series, I remember picking up a New Yorker magazine that had an article called "The Real Work: Modern Magic and Meaning of Life," and it was about Jamy Ian Swiss and the work that he does with young magicians. It was great research, got me off to a very, very good start.
For the whole Eli Marks series, right? I mean, it was a touchstone, a launching point.
Yes, that was the starting point, and I've kind of kept my eye on him ever since. When I did reach out to him for this, I recognized that he's asked to do this a lot and doesn't mind doing them, I guess, but I thought I want to come at it from a different angle. And the angle I wanted to come at it was from food, because he posts on Instagram great food photos and great food ideas and all that. And we didn't get to that.
I hope we'll have him back because he really is fascinating. And I saw him live at Monday Night Magic and have been a fan of Jamy Ian Swiss, but like you, was a little intimidated by him because I am not the most, I don't take a definitive point of view very often.
Right.
And so but boy, did I find him charming and fascinating, and one of those guys that could probably speak on any subject that you chose to have him speak on, John. He was great.
Yes.
Nice man.
And you mentioned Monday Night Magic. One of the other reasons I was afraid to approach him was because we had come up with our own Sunday Night Magic, which
was an homage.
It was an homage. That's what I was going to explain to him. It was an homage. Well, it was on Sundays. It took place at night, involved magic. Anyway, that was an adventure in itself. But as I was saying, when I started doing research for the series, that article was a great start. And then when it came time to do the second book, The Bullet Catch, I remembered something that I had heard or read that Jamy had said. Very first thing I have to say to you is, again, thank you, because years and years and years ago, I wrote you probably an email that said, I want to use a quote from you at the beginning of the second book in the Eli Marks mystery series, which is called The Bullet Catch. And the quote was, "Nothing is foolproof because fools can be very determined," which is a great quote and works in every one of those books, and actually works in life pretty well too, when you realize how determined they can be.
Where did you hear me say that?
Oh, if I kept good notes, I'd be rich by now.
Yeah, it's definitely me, but I've been saying it for years, and I've said it many times, but I don't recall where I wrote it. But I probably wrote it down somewhere.
Well, anyway, thank you for that. It's one of my.
Sure. Thanks for using it.
Yeah, there's one from you, and then there's another one from Teller that are my two favorite. That
What's the Teller quote?
Teller went, "Oh, you're gonna put me on the spot." Something like, most people don't understand that magic is really someone willing to work on something a whole lot longer than anyone would reasonably do.
Oh, yes, that's right. This is something I also quote a lot, especially in some talks for non-magicians. Teller says that the fact that no one would ever think we would ever work this hard to fool you is a method of magic.
Yeah, it's really, really true. So anyway, we're going to do just a little bit of early stuff, and then we've got a bunch of present day stuff to talk to you about. But first, a little bit of origin from you. I know that Wikipedia, which is always correct, says you got into magic at the age of 7. Do you remember how that came about?
When I was a little boy, I was extremely introverted, only child. I've since outgrown that phase. And my parents were always trying to introduce me to things, as they said in those days, to bring me out of myself. And so I was introduced to the arts and music and endless sort of activities and creative pursuits. And a friend of my dad's did a magic trick for him. And my father said, where do you get that? And the guy told him about Tannens magic. He went to Tannens magic. He asked about the trick. Lou Tannen sold it to him, taught it to him. And my father was not a magician, but he took us out, my mother and I, to a Chinese restaurant one night, and he performed the trick for me, which was quite astonishing and surprising for me. And then, not at the dinner table, but later at home, far from prying eyes like my mother's, he taught the trick to me. It's a famous trick called Color Vision Box. It's a wonderful little mind reading trick, and which you can repeat, and taught it to me. And this went now, and he began this process that went on for the next couple of years of him periodically. I would work very diligently, even at 7 or 8, on learning the script and learning the handling. And then he'd go and get another trick. And the only time my father ever performed was for me. But this was a brilliant insight on his part, because the biggest problem when you start in magic is when you learn the secret, you're invariably disappointed. It's always something surprisingly simple, just a piece of nonlinear thinking or something counterintuitive. And so when I would have that fear of how am I going to fool somebody with this? Is this going to work? He would be able to say, give me that touchstone and say, but remember how it fooled you when I performed it for you. Do you remember how the magic felt? And so that was really an inspiring way to start me.
That's great. That's a great story.
Thanks.
What a brilliant man your father must have been. Not just from that story, but knowing a little about you and having seen you at Monday Night Magic, you're a pretty bright fella. So as my father would say, it didn't fall far from the tree.
Absolutely true. I am my father's son.
When he took you to Tannens, do you remember who else did you meet at Tannens?
Well, first it was Lou, because way back then it was Lou. It was in the store that was in the Worldership building on the 12th floor across the street from Bryant Park. And, you took the elevator up and the door opened and it was a wonderland, a shock of chaos, of color and showcases and books and photos. It was just a magical place. So Lou was really my first sleight of hand teacher. He taught me sponge ball magic. He taught me dice stacking, and he taught me the chop cup routine. This is all when I'm 11, 12, 13. And all things that, profoundly influenced my work. My parents had they liked to entertain, and they had a little 4-seater bar in the apartment. They would throw a cocktail party, and I would be, 13 years old, 12 years old. And I would be behind the bar and I would be doing these tricks, and I would be doing, the chop cup with double big loads and fooling the hell out of these adults. And then, how'd you do that, kid? I'm sorry, I can't, it's past my bedtime. I got to go to bed. Whenever Copperfield and I are together, and especially the first time we hung out, reunited as adults, almost invariably when David and I are together, we just end up talking about Tannens, because we both grew up in that shop.
Did Frank Garcia frequent that shop?
Oh, Frank was there all the time. Frank was there all the time. Harry Lorraine was there all the time. They hated each other, but that's another story. And then famously, what all magicians of that era and place talk about is on Saturday afternoon, the store would close at 3:00, and we would all go over to what in that time was the governor's cafeteria, which was a really big kind of diner, and we'd sit in the back. They let us sit in the back away from everybody. And that's where a kid like me who was very shy and did not insert myself into these conversations, or other people did, but I would just kind of watch quietly. And I saw again, Harry Lorraine, Frank Garcia, all these guys over and over, plus visiting magicians, anyone who was coming through town, whether it was on a lecture tour or for a show or to be on the Ed Sullivan Show on Sunday night. I met Al Coran, the great Al Coran, mentalist. I saw him perform 2 nights on the Tannens on Broadway show, Friday and Saturday night. He did Sullivan on Sunday, but on Saturday afternoon, I approached him in the store nervously with a copy of his book that I had been studying, knowing that he was coming to New York, and asked him to sign it, and also asked him a question about something in the book I didn't understand that he promptly demonstrated for me several times and kind of blew my mind. All that could happen. I knew it was a terrific thing. All these, you would walk in on Saturday, it was like a magic convention, or Thursday night. They were open late on Thursday night. I remember asking Al Goshman on a Thursday night, could you show me this sponge ball vanish? And in his notoriously grumpy fashion, he went, here. And he just did it. And I was like, could you do it? Could you do it again? And he did it again. And he did it for me 6 times or something. And I really went home and learned a lot, got right to the mirror and duplicating and so forth. And in his grumpy fashion, he was inspiring and instructional. So I knew it was somewhat special, but the older I get, when I look back, I am more and more grateful for the opportunities I had, the great magicians I saw. I grew up going to the Tannens Jubilee. My dad took me to my first couple in my early teens. And, then by late teens and through to my 20s, I was going almost every year. And the close-up sessions would be, every year would be Slidini and Al Goshman and Derek Dingle and Harry Lorraine and Frank Garcia. It's just, endless over and over again. It's just mind-blowing. He's the greatest magicians who ever lived, greatest magicians I ever saw. And some years ago, I wrote what turned out to be a 71-part series called Take Two, that's online at magiccana.com. And what it is, it's curated video, 3 to 5 videos, accompanied by a 1,500-word, more or less, essay. A few are about tricks, a few are about particular styles or branches of magic. Most are about individual magicians, some contemporary, some historical. And it's written actually for non-magicians as well as magicians. I don't discuss any methods really anywhere in it. It's really art appreciation, and which is an area that magic is, the literature of magic, which is abundant as a performing art, but the literature of magic is highly deficient in art appreciation for non-magicians, which is a literature that's rich in every other art you can name. And so the Take Two is sort of a kind of art appreciation. And a lot of those people I wrote about were people I saw and met at Tannens growing up in magic, and paying tribute to them now, trying to celebrate them and explain what made them great,
I'll put a link to that in the show notes so that people can.
Yeah, there's an archive page that lists, there's 2 archive pages, I think, one by number and order of appearance and the other by subject. I think that's the greatest, briefly, I think that's the greatest contribution of Penn and Teller's Fool Us, because every time Penn talks about the act, he is providing art appreciation for non-magicians. Mm-hmm. And he is educating an audience of fans, magic fans.
We had the good fortune of talking to Michael Close about that recently, and one of the curtains he pulled back was when it comes to the way that Penn very artfully says to the magician,
the coding.
Mike said, "Oh no, we work all that out. We tell him that. He's not making that up on the spot." Oh, he really looks like he's making up on the spot, but no, that's all figured out ahead of time.
They're and also they're in his ear. They have that stuff ready, and they're in his ear. And when I say they, because eventually it became just Mike, but in the early years, it was my last and great mentor, Johnny Thompson, and Michael. Those guys make Penn look really smart.
They really do. That you've led us right into the next question. I want to jump ahead. In the Eli Marks series, I'm not a magician. I am a student of magic. I've become more and more a student of magic over the years because I have to in order to be good at writing about it and be correct about it. And I don't think I've had anybody say anything that I got wrong in a book. One guy did complain that I revealed the arm armpit tourniquet in the first book. And I said,
Uh-huh.
it's a dangerous thing. You shouldn't do it. So I don't mind revealing that. But I did get a nice email from Teller once saying, I read one of the books and you got the magic right. And most people don't when they write these kind of things,
Oh,
but you
very,
got it
very nice.
right.
You know, this is a role I performed for my friend Neil, my old friend Neil Gaiman in American
Oh,
Gods.
oh,
In
wow.
American
Okay.
Gods, the protagonist, Shadow,
Hmm.
teaches himself coin magic while he's in prison. And Neil and I first met during the time he was writing American Gods. My name appears in the credits and the
Mm.
acknowledgments in the back. And he's not like yourself, he's not a magician, but he's kind of a student of magic. He reads and he wanted the magic to be accurate and asked me if I would look at it all. And
That's fantastic.
so
That
I
is
Well,
did. Yeah.
as I say, I'm trying to be a student, a good student of magic. And when things happen in the magic world, I try to work them into the books. And when you
Nice.
were working with Johnny Thompson on that 2-volume set, I thought, well, that's perfect for the character of Uncle Harry, who is sort of a mix of Eugene Berger and Jay Marshall. If those two people came together, that's what Uncle Harry is to Eli. He is a mentor. He is a grouch. He's done everything, but he's a genius. So in one of the books, Harry has put out, with the help of a writer, a 2-volume set. So what was your process of working with Johnny on that?
Oh my God. So you know about Ken Klosterman, the collection being auctioned.
Yep.
So my friend Gabe Fahudi, who owns Potter and Potter Auctions, when after the death of Kenny Klosterman, who had one of the greatest private collections of magic memorabilia, and after he died, the family decided eventually to break up the collection and auction it. And Gabe Fahudi came out and spent with his crew of people and spent a week or whatever it was cataloging and packing the collection. And on the final weekend, he held some guided tours for people who wanted to come out. And I had known Ken and I had been there. I had actually stayed there 20 years before, but I wanted to see it in its intact state one more time and lock that into my memory because that will never exist again. And so I went out. And that evening, I stayed late after the tours were over. And we were talking. And one of the objects that was being sold was the prop case, the briefcase, actually the magic book, not the briefcase, of the great sort of European mentalist, close-up magician, Dr. Stanley Jacks. And he would go from table to table, and he had this thing that looked like a book, and it was actually, would open up, and it was this prop case. And he used all these beautiful, interesting props. Well, Gabe, in his youth, in his early college days, had called up Ken Klosterman and asked him if he could come and visit. And he did. And Kenny was showing him and a few other guys around the collection. And he came to this case and he came to a prop and mentioned that, I don't know what this is. I'm still trying to figure out what this is. And a very, very young Gabe Fahudi said, oh, that's in Tarbell. It's such and such. And Ken went, here's my phone number. Give me your phone number. And you are welcome here anytime. And subsequently, through his college years in the area, Gabe did come back many times. Why I tell you this story, what's powerful about it, is that years later, when Gabe was cataloging the collection, he took the case apart and he found a business card in there on which Ken had written his phone number that day.
That's fabulous.
And what Gabe said to me was, when he told me this story, he said, I didn't know I've been training all my life for this job.
That's awesome.
So that didn't even happen to me, and that story chokes me up. So
Yeah.
that's the most important thing about my writing of the Johnny Thompson books, because I didn't know that I had been training to write those books for years. When John and I became friends, which was relatively late, relatively late. It was in my 30s. I'd already been working at Mad, even though I was a late career change at 29. Still, I'd already been working as a full-time pro for some years and had my sort of first breaks and whatever. Then I met John. I met John in Japan along with Pam, and we worked this convention together. And then we ended up traveling thanks to Tono Osaka. Tono Osaka just paid to let me travel around for 10 days with Johnny. I hardly had any other work, but John had television work and a lecture and this and that. And for 10 days, we spent nonstop, 7 hours on the bullet train, just talking about Vernon and magic and this and that. By the time, and he taught me the egg bag in the hotel room and loaned me one to use, which many years later he asked me back and I refused to give it to him. and by the time that trip was over, we were fast friends. And as my friend Levent said, John was our last mentor. We had many mentors, but John was our last mentor. And I spent, just untold hours with John and going to shows. I saw him in shows constantly in Atlantic City and Las Vegas, playing these big rooms and so on for the public, not just magic conventions, but the real work. And I would just pepper him with questions. And it wasn't at first, it was about the stuff I was really interested in and doing, and Vernon. And I'd always been a Vernon guy, but he sort of completely upped and enlarged my understanding of Vernon. But I also asked him about all the other stuff. I asked him about it that I didn't do. I asked him about illusions. I asked him about history. I asked him about the Bird Act in detail. I would watch the Bird Act over and over again, and I would discover something new I hadn't noticed before, some little character thing, some little comedy beat, some little timing thing, some little misdirection, and I'd ask him about it, and he would explain to me how this worked, why this worked, how he wrote it, how it came about, whatever. So, when we were finishing the Johnny Thompson books, which took me 13 years to write, I said, we have to have, you're not teaching the act, the Thompsonian Company Act, but we have to have the act in here. We have to do something about the act. The publisher at that point was like, we're done. So I have to have this one more thing. And I wrote this piece that describes the act, literally describes the action of the act, but also looks at it, looks under the hood at it, and what's going on and what's happening, the character, the flow, the structure, all of the misdirection. And that's in the record, that's in the book. And it's something that Johnny loved. And I didn't know in those years, just like Gabe, I didn't know in all those years of him mentoring me, I was training to write the book. That didn't directly ask your question. As far as the process, when we just, he asked me over and over again over the years to write the book. I didn't want to do it. I just did not want to do it. I did not want the responsibility of his legacy, be the guy to record his legacy. And I also knew it was incredibly complicated and difficult and challenging. And I like writing, but I don't like writing technical descriptions of card tricks. I can do it, but I don't enjoy it. But finally, one summer came and he said, "Hey, are you doing much this summer?" He goes, "I went, not particularly." He's, a few things here and there, whatever. And he said, "Well, I'm actually not traveling. I'm going to be home in Vegas. Why don't you come? Let's start the book. Let's see what happens. Let's start it." All right. So I went, and Johnny and Pam were a second family to me. They were really a second pair of parents to me in many ways. And I went and I lived at the house for a month. And John and I worked full time on the big pieces, the big stake posts of the book that we knew were going to be the egg bag and the balls in the net and the $100 prediction, which is the longest piece in the book. And I knew when I wrote it, it would be the closing of the book. After I wrote it, I looked at it and went, this is the closing of the book because it incorporates everything in his work. It's incredibly mystifying, impenetrably mystifying. It's funny. It's packed small, plays big. You could do it in close-up. You could do it on a giant stage. And it was mentalism. It was not just straight conjuring. It was all these things. It brought everything into play that represented John's genius, the totality of it. And so in that month, we wrote all that stuff. He would talk to me in detail about it. Many of those tricks, the egg bag and the $100 prediction, I had been doing at that point for 20 years. He had given them to me 20 years before, and I had performed them on stage, which helped me to write them because I knew all the insides and outs. I once had an accident in a show with the $100 prediction where you put $200 on the line and you make it very explicit. If the trick screws up, you owe the spectator $200. You absolutely make this explicit. And there are some risks in this trick. And I made a mistake one night in a show. And I rescued it with an off-the-cuff solution that was insane. And I thought, everybody's looking at me. It's not going to fool anybody. And I'm desperately, trying to fix this thing. And then after the show, some magicians had come to them. And some of them said to me, "Wow, I never saw you do that prediction before. That was great. Fooled the hell out of me." And I'm like, and I was a well-posted guy. I'm like, I can't believe that worked. So I get back to New York and I called John. He had been away out of the country. I wait till he gets back. I call him. I said, "So listen, I think I finally managed to something that may be new to you. I made this disastrous mistake on this show, blah, 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 and how to get out of it." And he goes, "Oh, did you do such and such and this and that, something like that?" And I went, "Yeah." And he said, "Oh, it's happened to me 6 times.
Oh,
The guy knew everything about everything, you know. So anyway, it started in that orderly fashion for a month, but then it was videotapes, then it was revisits, then it was on email, then it was, it was a nightmare.
Is there a Johnny Thompson successor in the world today who banned that much of the art of magic? He just seems like one of a kind to me that maybe is,
Yeah,
we're not going to see that type
yeah. I
again.
think in some ways he's one of a kind. Partly that also had to do with the opportunity for the kind of work that was done. I have this conversation a lot with my colleagues. Our mentors, my generation, our mentors were workers. They did more shows than any human could imagine. They did, Johnny Thompson did 10,000 shows or more, I don't know, everywhere. Cruise ships, nightclubs, Europe, America, Las Vegas, on and on and on and on. You mentioned Jay Marshall. Jay Marshall was on the Ed Sullivan Show more than any other magician. I think it's like 9 times or something. He was the first magician who ever opened in Las Vegas. He was the first performer who ever opened in Las Vegas for Frank Sinatra. He did the London Hippodrome twice.
Jeez.
These are our mentors. The mentors today in magic are very often they're false idols. Sorry. They are pseudo mentors. They are often mentors who've never done a paying show.
Mm.
I was in a little group of people at Magic Live last year, and a conversation came up, and I stood up in the room and I said, I will pay $100 for anyone who has a photograph of so-and-so. I'll leave it off here. Doing a real show for real people. I'll pay $100 for a photo. This guy I'm talking about is famous, charges all kinds of money for a lot of blathering bullshit to children who don't know any better and think he's a mentor. How can you be a mentor if you've never done a show?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
let's talk about a mentor who had done shows, was a big mentor for Jim.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to spend a weekend with him during the last summer of his life. But he was one of the two guys that I looked up to be Uncle Harry when I created that character. And that's Eugene Berger. I want to talk about the workshop transcripts.
But I'm so pleased. I'm so pleased you know about this. Great.
He is mentioned in, I think, virtually every episode of the show that we do. And we're now in our 4th season and we're probably nearing 100 episodes. We just can't talk about magic without talking about Eugene. And I'm just curious, when did you first cross paths with him and what impact did he have on your life?
Yeah, so I once did a search. I forget the exact number. I did a search on Eugene's name in an electronic copy, a digital copy of my first book, Shattering Illusions. I think I mentioned his name like more than 60 times. So I was at my friend Peter Samuelson's loft in Manhattan around 1982. And he had this little book, this little black paperback, perfect bound book sitting on a table called Secrets and Mysteries for the Close-Up Entertainer. The weirdest title I ever saw in the history of a magic book. And I said, what is this? And he goes, oh, I don't know. He was doing something else. I think he was making dinner. And he goes, oh, I don't know. My friend of mine, this woman I know in Chicago, she's done some kind of seance shows with this guy. I don't know. But me being a compulsive reader, wanting to read everything, I said, can I borrow this? Yeah. And I took that book home. And it changed my life. I mean, no exaggeration. I read that little book 100 times. I squeezed the juice out of that book. And I became fascinated with this guy, Eugene Berger, whoever the hell he was. Nobody knew who he was at that time. And then it wasn't long after, a year or so after that, he began to show up and he started to lecture and he started to put out more of these pamphlets. He put out about maybe the 3rd one when he came to lecture in the New York vicinity. It was out on Long Island or something. I had to take a railroad, long, horrible trip to go find him, but I really wanted to see this guy. I saw him give this lecture. It was absolutely fantastic. And I remember him, a couple of things, talking about changing my life. He talked about repertoire, and he said, my current working repertoire is 28 tricks. Down from 43, I'm moving in the right direction. And I thought to myself, 28 tricks. Well, that's interesting because here's something I might be able to do an exercise that no magician ever tells you what is real repertoire is. He might teach a trick from his repertoire, but he doesn't tell you what the repertoire is. And I said, 28 tricks between everything that's mentioned in these 3 pamphlets. I just bought the 3rd one. And tricks he talked about today in the lecture, I bet I could put together a list of maybe 3/4, 80%. And I wonder if I could learn something from that, is the way I think. So, and plus we took the train home back to Manhattan together, had a wonderful conversation, included why he never did straight mentalism. And my book is, my Secrets and Mysteries copy is signed. He says, thank you for a good conversation. And I made that list, and I learned 2 things from studying that list in depth, like for a long time. And one was that every single trick except only one, it was only one trick that didn't have direct audience involvement in some way. Even the torn and restored thread, a trick that is always done as a performance piece, he had once he tore up the pieces and rolled them into a ball and stuck them on the thread, he turned to the spectator next to him and he said, "Can you do this?" And they would do this little gesture with their squeezing their first finger and thumb together. And he'd say, very gently, "Do that on the ball." And then he would show the restoration because the spectator had performed the magical effect, basically. I thought, this is mind-blowing. And I went through my repertoire and I threw out all the tricks that didn't involve the audience in some way, unless there was a really, really, really strong reason to keep it. So that was a phenomenal. And then I tried to add audience involvement to other tricks that were missing it. And this led eventually to a theory about what makes for good close-up magic. It's in my first book, and there's like 5 categories. The first one is audience involvement. And then I learned another deeper principle from it, which was that there were I'm into visual magic. If you watch my card magic, if you watch any of my clips on YouTube, it's extremely visual. There's all these, color changes, all this kind of visual, eye-popping, eye candy stuff. And I realized that in Eugene's work, there were only 2 or 3 actual effects could be called visual, because, card and matchbook, for example, which is one of my favorite tricks, and I started off on my path towards my routine, inspired by Eugene. It's not a visual effect. You don't see anything happen. You figure it out in your brain. When the folded card shows up in the matchbook, your brain tells you, oh, that used to be in a deck of cards. It had to vanish from the deck and get folded up and arrive in that matchbook. And how did that happen? But it's not visual. You don't see anything. The process, when you see the process, like in a color change, that's a visual effect. I noticed in Eugene's work, there were only 2 visual effects. One was accomplished with a gimmick. The other was accomplished by sleight of hand. I went, you can't get visual effects with subtleties. You can only get visual effects with a gimmick or sophisticated sleight of hand. And most of Eugene's work was not highly visual because he was not a sleight of hand technician. All the sleight of hand he did was perfect, but it was very carefully chosen to be within his means, within his reach. And, he never did a double lift his entire life, never did a double lift. So anyway, so that's how we started. That's how it began. But we became very close friends. And he was a help to me in many ways throughout my life, as a friend, as an advisor at times. And we spent countless hours, hundreds of hours on the phone, late night calls, gossiping, talking about magic. So I adored him and miss him. And, I do material of his, and I was doing material of his, right in that era in '85 when I went to be the magic bartender. I was doing material of his. And so he really influenced my repertoire. And so I was deeply involved in all of that category of material that is reflected in Final Secrets in the posthumous book. And I was very worried about that material. So was Max. Max Maven was a dear friend of mine. And he and I talked about it. And I was very worried about that material because Larry Haas had not been around in those days. And this stuff is really difficult to understand. And I love it. And I do all that material. So when the book arrived, I stayed up and I read the book cover to cover. And I called Max about it. And I thought, I really should tell Larry that. Larry and I were not particularly close friends, but I said, I ought to tell him. And I wrote him an email saying, thank you for doing justice to this material. And we got into this email exchange. And I said, by the way, there's a handful of things that I know that are not in the book that go back to either my personal interactions with Eugene, things he tipped to me in secret, things I saw at the workshops, et cetera, my years with him. And I shared a few things with him. And also, there's something that's missing from the Final Secrets book, which is the original description of Eugene's no gimmick way. There's a description of it in Final Secrets, but I grasped from the way they described it that nobody had the original instructions. And I had a copy, and apparently the only copy at the moment. Anyway, Larry and I talked for a string of 100 emails. And then, and I also had a recording. I had found a recording on only half. The half is missing, but I have a recording of one of the workshops. And he already had a recording from someone else, from Bill Evans. And then another recording showed up, or two more showed up, and he ends up with like 3.5 recordings of the workshop. And this, combined with our conversations and so on, 3 months later, he came back to me and said, "You know what? I think maybe there's another book here. And not to just make a book for the sake of making the book, but that if I just transcribe the workshops, then for serious students of the subject matter, we have Eugene's words explaining it, not me explaining it, Eugene explaining as he really explained it." And I said, I thought that was a great idea. And he asked me if I would contribute something, and I wrote an essay for it. And I'm really happy for it, because I'm happy for Eugene's contribution to be recorded. I'm happy for the instructional value of it. But I'm frankly also happy because I'm not the guy who is typically associated with Eugene's name. Eugene in later years was in mystery school and all of that. Everybody thinks Eugene and Jeff and Eugene. And we forget, I think, now, even in honoring him, we forget that the bulk of the handful of the really killer books, Mastering the Art of Magic, which is a collection of all the first pamphlets in the first years, which is a book I assigned to all of my students. And then Performance of Close-Up, Experience of Magic, and Craft of Magic, whatever, those 3 hardcovers. Those books, which are his best works, he was a worker. First and foremost, Eugene Berger was a worker. I booked Eugene. I flew him down to Florida once for a gig. It was one of the hardest, toughest conditions where I brought in like a dozen magicians some from LA and some from around the country. I had the budget, and I booked him, the hardest conditions, because he was a worker. He did card tricks for paying people in real world conditions. His methods were practical and effective. His effects were miraculous. And I think we forget. We're in danger of forgetting that. He was a big part of my work, my life.
Yeah.
Yeah. You when John asked the question about is there anybody today, you kind of are in that position that you have access to have seen some of the greatest magicians who ever lived, actually saw them,
Yes.
learned from them. That's a unique place that you are in. So are there, other than, let's say, Di Vernon, Johnny Thompson, and Eugene, who we've already kind of touched on, are there other magicians that, living or dead, that you would say, boy, I really admire their work, what they did and how they did it?
Oh, it's endless. There's 71 pieces talking about that in the Take-Two series. I mean, I grew up watching Slidini and Al Goshman. Al Goshman was one of the probably 2 greatest close-up magic entertainers I ever saw in my life. The other would be Del Rey. But I knew Goshman somewhat, and one of the most profound experiences for me was when the first time I worked at I performed and lectured at the Magic Castle, which is 1988, I think. On Friday afternoon, Vernon showed up at my show. I tremble now. To think of it, and I popped my thumb tip, no joke. And I was nervous, man. My hands were shaking, and I came. You did a couple of lunch. I think it was Friday afternoon, the lunch shows, and I came out to the bar and I apologized to him. I was sorry, and he was, no, it was really good. It was really good. I liked it. I said, no, I can do better than that. Would you come back to the show? Come back to the show. Oh, I don't need to come back to the show. It was really good. I liked it. Well, he comes, and then I come out to the next show. They introduce me. I walk out. There he is again. And and I was a little better the second time, a little calmer the second time. And later in the week, I walked in one night to the club. This is self-aggrandizing. I apologize, but I'm really talking about the nervousness of it and how uncertain I was. And I walked into the club, and then one of the hostesses from the front desk, came chasing in behind me, and I thought, oh, what have I done wrong? I've broken a rule. And she said, I just wanted to tell you that the professor came up to me and told me that I must come and see your show, and he never does that. He almost never does that. So I thought you might like to know that.
Oh,
wow, right? But even though the reason I'm telling you this, even though that was profound for me, nevertheless, the greatest single compliment I ever received in my life was that same week when Al Goshman showed up in my room and watched the show. And show's over. There's a knock at the dressing room door, and I open the dressing room door, and it's Max, who's a dear friend of mine for over 40 years, and who, all right, that's hard to talk about. And anyway, it was Max. And I opened the door, and he said, do you know who was just in your show? And I went, yeah, how could you miss him, you know? He said, go talk to him. I said, no, I don't think so. Gosham was famously grumpy, terrible critic. He said, go talk to him. I said, no, I don't think so. It's fine. He was in the show. That's great. I don't need it. Jamy, go talk to him. Okay. So I went out. He was sitting at a cocktail table in what was then the Vernon area. And I said, hi, Albert. Thanks for coming to my show. Sit down. I sit down. I'm a grown-ass man here. I'm like 30-odd years old. And then he proceeded to compliment the hell out of my show. And then gave me one note. You don't need this. Take that out. And it was a thing that was a kind of a gag thing and not a magic thing. And he was like, you don't need that. The magic's really good. You don't need it. And I took it out the next show. And then the next time I was at the castle, I performed at the castle a year later or something. He showed up again with his companion, and again, knock on the door. I open it. It's Max. He goes, do you realize that Albert just came back to see your show a second time? He never does that. I said, yeah, that was pretty great. He goes, go talk to him. I said, no, I talked to him last time. It's fine. Jamy. I walk out. Albert, thanks for coming back to my show. Yeah, I just wanted to bring her in. I thought you should see your show. That's it. We only came in to see your show. I'm going home.
Wow.
That's two
great.
pretty good compliments in 1 week. It's
not, well, I was the best compliment I ever got in my life, because he's maybe the best magician I ever saw when you add it all up. So yes, the longer answer is, or the shorter answer, I don't know, is yes, countless. I can tell you, and completely out of my category. The first time, the greatest illusionist I ever saw was Ricciardi. And the first time I saw him was at Top of the Gate in Greenwich Village. I had no idea what I was in for. And he does the opening, and as he's handling the props, as he's taking it apart to reveal the trick, it's this quick transposition. It's visual, it's done to music. And he is hurling. He's not tossing the props to his assistants. He is hurling the props to his assistants, and he is not looking. I'm looking at this going, holy Jesus, these guys must get injured. They must go to the hospital. And, it was one of the greatest shows I ever saw in my life, because the hard part of illusions is convincing the audience that there's some connection between you, the performer, and what's happening with this big apparatus very often, But when he levitated that girl off the floor, this layer of smoke, and his music is rhythmic and playing, and he's doing this timely gesture that my dear friend Lance Burton took as inspiration for when Lance years later did the levitation, different method. And Ricciardi is doing this thing, and he's doing this gesture, and he's getting her to rise, and it's all in the music, and he looks like a toreador and whatever. And you just knew that, God forbid, if somebody walked out and grabbed him by the arm and made him stop doing that, she was going to crash to the floor.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. All right. So I think I have two more questions, if you have the time.
Okay.
Two more questions.
Sure, yeah, so, I absolutely have the time.
Okay. So I'm fascinated by the James Randi Foundation and the $1 Million Challenge. And I know you're on that committee. And I'm fascinated by that's what led me to Eugene, not that particularly, but my fascination with spiritualism in his book.
Did you read my book, Conjurer's Conundrum?
No, but I think I should.
Yeah, because the Conjurer's Conundrum is a small book I wrote a few years ago, published by Vanishing Ink. It's part of their astonishing essay series. So it's a small book, maybe 30,000 words, and it's about the intersection, the historical intersection between magic and skepticism and critical thinking. And the first half of the book is about that history, and the second half of the book is about my history with it.
Well, I got to get that book then, because that's what led me. Spirit Theater is what led me to Eugene in the first place.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So we had a great
I
time.
did. I'm one of three people who did a theatrical seance in the U.S. in the year after the release of the publication of Spirit Theater. And there were three shows around the country. They were all inspired. We weren't all doing directly Eugene's show, elements of Eugene's show to varying degrees. And I did mine in Washington, D.C. that year.
Well, I reached out to Eugene. There's I've told this story a couple of times on the podcast, so I'll try not to make it long. But I walked into our magic store here in downtown Minneapolis, Eagle Magic, and the owner of that magic store said, "Hey, a book just arrived that you've been waiting for your whole life." And he showed me Spirit Theater, and at the time it was $50, and it was like, well, that's all the money in the world. I don't have that.
Right.
I went to a poker game and happened to win. I came back the next day, bought the book, read the book. He was right. I'd been waiting for it my whole life. Long before, this is 85, I think, would be about right. November of 85.
Sounds about right, yeah.
And long before you could Google somebody or anything like that.
Right, sure.
So I called 411 in Chicago and said, I'm looking for the number for Eugene Berger. Yep, here it is. And so I just called him and said, I read your book. I'm really interested in doing your show. I'm wondering if you've sold the rights to anybody or who I would contact in order to perform your show. And he said, who is this? And I told him, and he said, I'm just walking out the door. Can you call me in a week? And I said, yes, of course. And so I called him in a week, and he said, right, yes, I'm just going to the dentist. Can you call me in a week? And I said, sure, I'll call you in a week. And so I called him, and then years later, he said, that's my method. If somebody calls me and wants something, I put them off a couple of times to see if they're serious. And so then I called him back, and we talked for a while, and eventually he said, I'm going to give you permission to do the show on these two conditions. I don't want any money, but what I'm going to ask is you, not being a magician, have to come to Chicago, and we're going to talk about what you're going to do in your front half of the show. And then I want you to fly me to Minneapolis and put me up and set up a lecture for me, and I'll work with you and your team on the back half of the show. So it was a gift from God that, and I did it for 5 years, and I still do a Halloween version of it.
Oh, is that right? Okay, yeah. Well, so you're one of those three shows that I was talking about. Great.
In my copy of Spirit Theater, he has written to my dear friend Jim Cunningham, who also lived this book.
Oh, so, that's fantastic.
Yeah,
that's great.
So he was just tremendously generous to me, and but I think I don't know this for a fact, but I think his show for Sunday Night Magic may have been his last public performance. I knew he was not well, and when I took him to the airport, he said, I'm going to the doctor, and I said, listen, would you text me and let me know what the doctor said? And he said, oh, I don't know. I said, Eugene, I'm going to be really thinking about you, so would you text me? And he said, yeah, I'll text you. And so 2 days after he went to the doctor, he texted me, he said, it's arthritis. I'm going to get some physical therapy and everything's going to be fine. And a month later, I got a call from Derek saying, I don't know if you heard, and so that he was dynamite for me. But that James Randi Foundation, James Randi came through here. In fact, I have a force book that I bought from James Randi occasionally will use. But that idea of I've got $1 million if you can do anything that I can.
Right.
Are there any of those cases that you have worked on that were intriguing that you thought, what the heck?
No. So just to clarify, the $1 Million Challenge was retired when Randy retired. And then and is no longer extant. And then the James Randi Educational Foundation did not shut down, but the foundation still exists, but it only exists in a very, very small version, which is that it quietly gives grants to people doing good work, and that's all it does. It's sort of like the MacArthur Awards in a way. Anyway, so that's behind us. But yes, I was on the $1 Million Challenge committee along with a handful of other key people who were not necessarily the faces of it, but were deeply involved behind it, notably Chip Denman, who was a statistician, and you can't do those tests without a statistician. But this question, which is a common question about, did anything ever interesting show up? Actually, the more common question is, did you ever catch a fraud? Because at the TAM conferences, the last event, the conference would finish Sunday during the day, but on Sunday night, we would typically do a live $1 Million Challenge on stage, which Banachek and I were typically the hosts of, but we very often had other people like Chip Denman along with us. And some of those are actually on YouTube, and some of them get views, which to me is a paranormal event because they're so long and slow and dull and boring because it's a test. It's a testing thing. So, but anyway, so the thing to understand about that I think people don't understand is frauds, deliberate frauds, as opposed to self-deceived. Deliberate frauds never show up for a challenge, for a test, because they know they'll get caught. And also because they don't need you. They're making plenty of money on their own, Geller always bragged about having fooled the morons at the Stanford Research Institute, but he never subjected himself to a test. Once he got away with that, which wasn't even a test, they're doing crap in his hotel room. He's doing tricks in the hotel room that they report on, morons. But once he got to brag about that, he never went near a test again, ever, because he knew he'd get caught, and he didn't need it. You can fool some of the people all the time, and that's how con artists work. So what shows up, and the problem with the MDC is that we would devise we didn't have off-the-shelf tests. We only had off-the-shelf tests once that we created for ABC Nightline, where they wanted to do $1 million test on the line for TV, single round of tests, which is not how the MDC normally worked. And we did that. Banachek and I did that. But other than that, we didn't have off-the-shelf tests. We devised the testing protocol based on the claim. And part of the problem of the $1 Million Challenge was we got claims that were nutty from nuts. And, you had to sift through, the letters on crayon about how, I was taught this on Mars. I mean, it's really like insane. So to get somebody to go through the process and to agree to the test and agree to the protocol and to design a protocol that we felt would work, we had confidence in, it was valid, and at the same time that they would agree to, it was just a nightmare process. And over the years, contrary to charges from the other side, we kept lowering the threshold for the first round because the MDC was designed as a 2-level test. There was like a preliminary that would be a lower threshold, and then there would be the real test for the $1 million that was at a required threshold. And we kept lowering the threshold on the preliminary test. The live test was the preliminary test to see if we could get somebody to pass, but nobody ever did. And in almost all cases, and it's hard to know for sure, you can't speak for sure what's in another person's mind, but in almost all cases, we believe that we were invariably testing people who were self-deceived and who believed. And, the classic example of this is like dowsing. Dowsing works on the ideomotor response. You're actually moving the sticks, but you don't believe you're moving the sticks because you're not moving it consciously and you're not aware that you're moving the sticks. And in fact, you'll deny that you're moving the sticks, but you're moving the sticks. And we know we're moving the sticks because dowsing is easy to test, because first we run a preliminary where we show you where the gold or the water or whatever the hell it is. And wonder of wonders, then they go across it, the sticks cross, and we found it. And then we do the double blind and nobody knows where it is. And then the results are approximately the prediction of random chance. And then they go, I don't know, I was having a bad day. And we see, and every test becomes, Banachek and I always talked about this, every test becomes a demonstration of the mechanism of cognitive dissonance. that's wired into human brains to help us cope with the fact that we have consciousness on the one hand, but we make mistakes on the other because we have all of these biases, cognitive biases that are also wired into our brains. And so we have to cope with that. And in doing the test, we would just literally watch people recover from the failure. And they invariably afterwards, after you ask them in advance, did you agree to the test? Yes. Is this a fair test? Yes. How do you think you'll do in the test? I'm going to get the million. Then you have the same interview afterwards. And they say, it wasn't really a fair test. It's not exactly what I do. I was having a bad day, blah, blah, blah. That's how cognitive dissonance works. So no, the bottom line is, no, I never saw anything interesting. No, I never saw anything that I found questionable or possibly paranormal. And no, we didn't catch frauds because frauds don't show up for tests.
Okay. Yeah. The whole subject matter fascinating to me, and I'm going to get your book.
You will like my little book.
I will.
You will like my little book.
Absolutely, I will.
Okay, one last question to wrap things up. And you may not have an answer to this, but I first became aware of you when I was studying to write the first book, because as I've said, I'm not a magician. I had a huge learning curve to write that first book. I took lessons from Suzanne. I was lucky enough to have a world-class magician in the city who gave lessons. And half of what she taught me was what's the day-to-day life of a working magician. And the other half was how to do an ambitious card routine. So I did a lot of reading of books. And one of the things I came across was an article in the New Yorker about a magician named Jamy Ian Swiss sitting on a plane teaching a kid how to make some card moves. And fascinating article.
That kid is 29 now and working on his PhD.
Well, that was a seminal piece of research for me starting, because there's kind of a built-in history of magic within that article. He touches on a lot of different things besides talking to you.
Yes.
But in that article, you said at every moment in the history of magic, there's an anti-magician to go along with the mainstream magicians. And I'm just curious, Jamy, is there an anti-magician working today?
At the moment, not really. I mean, the last of the anti-magicians to come to the forefront was David Blaine. And Blaine was revolutionary. Bottom line, he transformed how we watch magic on television. Prior to David, the formula for the annual magic special, network TV special, which was sort of formulated by Doug Henning and then adopted and refined and advanced, if you will, by David Copperfield. But it was the same fundamental kind of idea. It was mostly stage magic. It was stages of Las Vegas sort of as a model, big mega trick at the end, one close-up trick in the middle. And that's the way we did it. And Blaine undid all that, threw all that out. And as someone, so I've done a fair amount of magic on television, and I've been involved both in front of the camera and behind the camera. I've been behind the camera as a writer, producer, director, magic designer, whatever, worked with Penn and Teller in that capacity, among many others. And I've done a fair amount of magic in front of the camera. And so the thing you discuss when you do that kind of work, the thing that we're always discussing is credibility. How do you convince the home audience that what they're seeing is real and it's not just a camera trick? It's not just creative editing. And in the old days, it was the celebrity host who would come on at the beginning of the show and, James Earl Jones would say, I solemnly swear that everything you're about to see is exactly what you would see if you were in the live studio audience. And that was true. Blaine turned it around, and as credibility, he pointed the camera at the audience. And the credibility is the audience going, and that's the credibility factor. Now, the funny thing about that is it had a couple of revolutionary impacts. Number one, it finally made close-up magic, gave close-up magic a way to become the feature magic of television magic. That was a new thing. And that is what led, I believe, to a show like Fool Us, and to the fact that there's like 15 close-up venues around the country now featuring close-up magic. I think that all stems from Blaine, but it also actually gives you a little more room to cheat. Ironic as that may be. But I'm not saying, I don't mean by that David routinely cheated in his shows. He did a bit in the early days. But I'm an admirer of David, and his impact was profound. And he was absolutely the anti-magician. He's a guy in sneakers and a t-shirt, out in the street in a in a lot strewn with trash, in a beat and a boom box apparently, where of course all the good looking girls hang out, as we know. Of course, the beauty of that is that he was selling. I wrote a very, very, very long essay about this called "In Search of Street Magic," because street magic used to mean, that term, we'll just put this aside, used to mean busking, which is a professional form of performance of gathering a crowd and doing a show. We still do that. That's a very respectable form of magic. But the term street magic got taken over by David using that term, and street magic became this thing of doing close-up magic for gathered people on the street in front of a TV camera. And I wrote a very long essay many years ago. It's online. It's on my blog. Basically said there's only 5 magicians in the world that do street magic, and you can tell because there's a camera crew following them around. And other than that, it's not a real form. It's a fake form. It's not really a form. It's not really a venue. It's not something you make a living at. But the street magicians were selling a fantasy to amateur magicians, and that's okay. I actually kind of defend that. A lot of people miss this. I actually kind of defend it in the piece because I point out that as kids, when we opened the Tannens catalog and we looked at those wonderful illustrations by Nelson Hani of the nightclub magician, in tails with a cigarette holder, we wanted to be that guy. We saw ourselves as that guy. Well, now there was a generation of young magicians who saw themselves in Nikes and a t-shirt, wowing all the screaming pretty girls in the abandoned lot in the urban environment. So anyway, he was really an anti-magician. There's no question about it. And I don't really think there's been one since. I think it's really interesting. As I mentioned, Fool Us has been very valuable because it has raised the audience's appreciation for the fact that magic is fundamentally an interpretive art. It's like the Great American Songbook. It's not the singer, it's the song. That's the message of Fool Us, which is interesting because Penn produced a film you're probably familiar with called The Aristocrats. It was produced by Penn. It was directed by my friend Paul Provenza. And the whole message of Aristocrat, I was around, I saw 9 cuts of The Aristocrats. And the first one was like 3 hours. But the whole point of The Aristocrats is it's not the song, it's the singer. That's the message of The Aristocrats. That's the message of Fool Us. And I think that message has gotten through to the point that it's perhaps there's a connection here. I don't know. It has subdued the need or the likelihood of an anti-magician. Doesn't mean we won't have another one. We will.
Well, maybe we'll have another anti-magician. Maybe we won't. We just don't know how that's going to end up. But that concept of it's the song, it's not the singer. I don't know if you've ever seen The Aristocrats.
I have twice.
Twice, okay.
Yeah. You wouldn't think you need to see it twice, but
no,
I did because I really enjoyed the entire experience and wanted to do it again. So I saw it first time with a bunch of my buddies, and then the second time I watched it alone, more as a study for myself.
Right. Well, it was a great reference that he used to tie into the idea of anti-magicians and what the point of the trick is. And then as I'm thinking back on this long interview with him, holy cow, he met the great and the near great just at Tannens.
Yeah.
Just there.
Yeah, he has such a wealth of experience, and he talked to, was mentored by, spent time with the people that I would love to have seen, either just seen live. Frank Garcia, who I think is, one of the best ever. All the people he talked about were like, holy mackerel. This is the who's who of the who's who.
And that's just at Tannens. And then outside of that world, the connection with Eugene, the fact that you both have done spirit theater in your own form, which, I don't know who else has done it, but we've talked to him and you and Dr. Richard Wiseman. So that's 3 people who did spirit theater in their own form.
And we also talked to Larry Haas, who I believe is very deeply involved in Eugene's post career, I suppose.
Yes.
And I know that he's done some spirit theater. So it's certainly a love of mine, and great to talk to him. And here's the thing, as as it's not like I'm an intimate best friend of Eugene or anything, but I had a substantial amount of contact with him. I had no idea about Jamy Ian Swiss, so that made it even sweeter for me.
Yeah. And then the whole Johnny Thompson part of it.
See, and there's another guy that I would love to have seen live. I just worship him. So, but what a cool interview that was, and I do hope he's willing to come back and chat food with us or anything. And I did buy his book, and he sent it to me right away. And you can click on his website if you'd like him to sign it and personalize it. And he did both of those things for me.
Oh, that was
And
nice.
it's a great book. So plenty to think about where Jamy Ian Swiss is concerned.
Yeah, just a great chat. Thank you, Jamy, for saying yes, and we would love to have you back. We'll work on that for a later season. Speaking of things we love, it's time for the I Love That segment, and I believe that in a episode that begins with an odd number like 417, you go first.
Oh, okay. I love to grill, especially it's a very short amount of time here where we live that you can, although last year, not so much of a winter. So I don't grill as often as I would like, but I
Can I
love to
just
do it.
say, my
Yeah.
wife and I were doing landscaping work in February. That's the winter we had.
I'll tell you what, folks, while the rest of the country has been red hot, we've been cool. And while you may talk about our winters, we didn't have one. So move to Minnesota for the weather. How about
Yeah,
that?
that's
But I do. I love to grill. I read a lot about grilling, and I watch every time he puts something up on his YouTube channel. A guy named Cowboy Kent Rollins out of Oklahoma, who's a tremendous grill artist, and he
mhm.
makes it so simple. And he has given me tons and tons of tips about how to get the best out of my grilling experience. So my love it tip: if you love to grill, you ought to go on YouTube and check out Cowboy Kent Rollins out of Oklahoma and the grilling show that he puts on. Because if it's pork or steak or burgers or side dishes, whatever you want, he's charming, funny, insightful, and he makes it seem very easy.
Boy, you said early on what's going to happen on that day when we both pick the same I love that.
This isn't today, is it?
That is not today. No, I will have a link to those videos for all of our listeners. I will track that down because I'm surprised as anyone that's yeah, I love it, but it sounds great.
It is.
And
And you know what? And this is my final tip on Cowboy Kent Rollins. Only watch it after dinner, because if
ah,
you watch it before, you're going to eat so much
yeah.
because he makes it look so good and you'll
Mhm.
be so hungry. So it's something to do after you have filled your stomach, because if you do it before, and I've done it that way, it's never good. It's never
Yeah.
good.
Nice safety tip, Egon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Go.
mine is nothing like that. Probably couldn't be further away. I was reminded of it because of the New Yorker article about Jamy Ian Swiss, and it's a cartoon that appeared in the New Yorker several years ago. I liked it so much, I laughed at it so much that my wife actually bought a reproduction of it and framed it, and it hangs in our kitchen. The image is this. It's a very sketchy image. It's of an apartment that has been completely demolished. There are two policemen in the apartment. The door's been ripped off the hinge. All the windows are broken. The drapes are gone. The couch is a mess. The chairs are tipped over. There's a dead body lying on the floor. And one of the policemen is looking at the remains of the computer on the computer table. And the caption is, his final internet search was "Insane Monkey, How Make Calm Down."
All right, that's funny.
It is funny, and it is the perfect internet search for that issue. Insane
Yes.
Monkey, How Make Calm Down. Now, I believe this cartoon came out before Jordan Peele's movie Nope. Spoiler alert, there's a problem with a monkey in that movie as well. But it is I would laugh every time I see it in the kitchen. It gives me a smile. So I'll post it for everyone. The artist's last name is Steed. It is a messy picture, but it's a gorgeous picture. His final internet search was insane monkey, how make calm down. I love that. That's
I
why
love it
it's
too
there.
now. It's that's what this whole segment is about. But let's get back down to business, pal. Now,
Yes,
if I'm correct, last time I read it was chapter 16. So
that's
before
right.
I launch into chapter 17, just recap 16 for us.
Sure. That's where Eli was at that corporate event and had to wear that terrible rabbit holding a hat with a magician in it costume. Quentin did a walk through the brick wall. He did the zigzag with Megan as his subject. As soon as he can leave, Eli leaves. He runs into Sherry Lisbon, who's one of 4 suspects in the murder of the projectionist. And he walks her to her car in the ramp because it is a downtown ramp and it's a little scary. He recognizes as she drives away that the ramp is right next to the Kavanaugh condo building, Kavanaugh being one of the other suspects. Eli goes home. He places an ad to buy London After Midnight in an online forum. And then he gets a call in the morning from Deirdre that one of his interviewees is dead. And that takes us right into chapter 17.
Dun dun dun.
Chapter 17. The warm early morning light on Clifford Thomas's mansion on Summit Avenue did nothing to dispel the constant gloomy pall which seemed to hang over the house. The addition of several squad cars, unmarked police cars, and the crime scene van didn't do much to lighten the mood either. Tex had created a path of sorts that civilians like me could use to get to the house without negatively impacting the crime scene, so I gingerly made my way along the narrow strip, cordoned off with yellow crime scene tape, finally arriving at the front door. Deirdre was standing on the steps, either waiting for me or wishing she could grab a smoke, or both. She'd given up the habit years before, but I knew when things got tense, her craving would kick in and she'd try to assuage it with nicotine gum. Given the force with which she was chewing, she appeared to have taken on a full pack. "They just took the body away," she said, turning and heading back into the house. "The crime scene itself is still fresh," she continued as I followed her, "but we can look around without tainting the chain of evidence." The front hall was as I remembered it from my previous visit, but instead of a smiling Clifford Thomas greeting me, the foyer was swarming with cops and techs and others whose functions weren't immediately apparent. "What happened?" I asked, recognizing my understatement for what it was. "Best as we can tell, Mr. Thomas had a visitor or visitors at some point last evening. There is no sign of forced entry, so we're assuming he knew the person or persons and let them in of his own volition." I remembered my comment to him about his odd willingness to greet fans at the door and the offhanded way in which he had laughed it off. "And then?" "And then, at some point while in the library," she said, gesturing to the large room where I'd met with the writer, "Mr. Thomas was attacked and stabbed with a letter opener." "Mr. Thomas in the library with the letter opener," I mumbled. "What?" "Nothing. I noticed the secret bookcase doorway was in its open position, and I could see uniformed techs working within the room." "That door was open?" I asked, gesturing to the bookcase. "What door?" Deirdre said, giving me a look. "The front door?" "No, that bookcase. It's a door. It slides open and closed, revealing the room behind it." Deirdre moved toward the bookcase and gave it the once-over, peering behind it and then looking up at the recessed tracks in the ceiling. She gave a small grunt and then made a quick scribble in her notebook. "Don't know. It was open when we got here." "Who found him?" "Housekeeper. She comes in 3 times a week, prepares some meals for him to eat later, and then does some light cleaning. She's been with him for years." "Did she recognize the letter opener?" Deirdre nodded. "She said it was his. It was always on the top of his desk." "So you're thinking the visit was planned, but the murder was an afterthought?" "That's one theory." "Anything else missing?" Yep, and that's where it gets a little weirder. She walked past the bookcase into Clifford Thomas's inner sanctum. The desk and the typewriter atop it had been dusted for fingerprints, and a photographer was just finishing taking pictures of the desk and the objects on it, which consisted of a pencil, 2 pieces of mail, and the typewriter. A key space on the desk was empty. "They took the manuscript," I said quietly. Deirdre turned sharply, stopping in her tracks so quickly I nearly collided with her. "Yes. How did you know that?" "Because when I was here, he made a show of taking a piece of paper out of the typewriter and adding it to the stack next to it. He said he always types his books and then someone else inputs them into a computer for editing." The housekeeper said the same thing. "The current book is always next to the typewriter." I shrugged. "When I was here a couple of days ago, he said he was almost done with it. Maybe—" She shook her head. "We called his typist. He told her to come over today to pick it up." I gestured toward the desk, and Deirdre nodded. I walked around the hulking oak bureau, looking at it from all angles, hoping this would spur some insight. None were coming. "The typist said when he finished a manuscript, he always went through the same ritual. He'd add the title page, wrap it up in a ribbon, and then go out for a drink. The Summit Club down the street said he came in last night around 5:30, had what he called a celebratory cocktail, and went home. That was the last anyone saw of him until the housekeeper found him this morning." "And that door was open?" I asked, gesturing to the sliding bookcase. "She said she walked right in." I looked at the desk again and noticed the small knob Clifford Thomas had pulled on when I visited. I gestured to Deirdre. Since she was the one wearing gloves and I wasn't, she slowly pulled the knob. As before, the wooden surface slid out, but unlike the last time, I was now at an angle where I could really see the surface of the board. A piece of lined white paper, about 4 by 7 inches, was taped to the board in a charmingly haphazard manner. A list of handwritten titles filled the sheet, some written in pencil, some in pens with different ink, but all were in the same unhurried hand. I recognized 2 recent Clifford Thomas titles, Polar Vortex and his latest bestseller, The Endless Killing Frost, but the rest of the titles were unknown to me. However, the list was in keeping with the tone of all of his novels. Blizzard Watch, Winter Storm Warning, A Snowball's Chance, The Milfoil Invasion, Frost Point, and the title I had inadvertently supplied to him, Snowblind. "What's this?" Deirdre asked, moving into my personal space to survey the list. I stepped aside. "He added a title to this list when I was here," I explained. "It's his list of potential titles. I guess the title was always the last thing he added to the manuscript." "The missing manuscript has one of these titles?" "I would think so, unless it was already in his head and he never added it to the list. 2 of the titles have already been used, so apparently he derived no pleasure from crossing each one off when he used it." "Apparently," she said, but I could tell she didn't seem interested in where this conversation was heading. She signaled to one of the tacks, who scurried over as if pulled in on a fishing line. "Make a note of these titles," Deirdre said, gesturing to the list, "and make sure the photographer gets a shot of it as well." "I'm not sure that'll be of much help," I said, giving the list one final look. "You never know," she said as she headed across the room. I followed her, then stood in the archway to the secret room for a long moment. I could hear Deirdre retracing her steps and coming up behind me. "What?" she asked, clearly a little annoyed I was still standing there. "I don't know," I said, giving the room and the sliding bookcase one last look. "I can't help but think if there was going to be any mystery about how he died, Clifford Thomas would have preferred it be a locked room mystery." "Don't worry," she said, moving toward the front door with me right behind her. "There's still plenty of mystery to go around. Fred is bringing in the other 3 suspects for some questioning about their whereabouts last night, and their relationship with the late Clifford Thomas. Tag along and you can listen in. I gave the secret room one last look and wondered, not for the first time, what sort of solution Clifford Thomas might have devised for this ever-evolving mystery had he not just become its most recent victim. It was really fascinating to see how each of the 3 remaining suspects in the death of Tyler James reacted to the police request for them to come in for an informal interview about this most recent murder. Both Chip Kavanaugh and Sherry Lisbon brought their lawyers, but the similarity between these 2 suspects ended right there. Chip Kavanaugh seemed to delight in speaking at length after his lawyer had stated his client would not be answering a particular question. He came in grinning and presented variations on this smile from wide to sardonic throughout the course of the interview, even watching through the one-way mirror, and with their backs to me, I could sense the annoyance of Homicide Detective Fred Hutton and Assistant District Attorney Deirdre Sutton Hutton at his persistent snarky attitude. "He's a real cutie pie, isn't he?" The voice came from behind me, and I turned to see Homicide Detective Miles Wright leaning in the doorway and watching the proceedings through the glass. "Fred and I did the initial interview with him. He was a shifty pain in the ass then, too." I could imagine Chip Kavanaugh would have had great fun playing with these 2 serious detectives. "Did you talk to him in his home or at work?" "In his office," Wright said as he grabbed a chair and plopped into it. "What, is he a jerk at work and a nice guy at home?" "He seems to be pretty insufferable regardless of the location," I said, wondering if either detective would have raised an eyebrow at the art collector's art-free living room with its white-on-white walls. "I hear that." We both sat back in silence as the questioning continued. "You're saying you have no alibi last night from roughly 9 p.m. until 8 a.m. this morning?" Homicide Detective Fred Hutton recited this question slowly, perhaps to forestall having to listen to a lengthy answer from Chip. "Yes, officer, I was alone in my apartment all night. Alone, but not lonely, if you take my meaning." Another big grin, as if we had somehow missed a very clever joke within his statement. "And so unless some person or persons unknown were aiming a high-powered telescope into my apartment from another skyscraper in downtown St. Paul, I'm afraid I will be unable to provide an alibi for my whereabouts last night during the hours in question." Deirdre jumped in, I think in part to keep her husband from reaching across the table and throttling Kavanaugh. "Did you know Clifford Thomas?" Chip's attorney, a heavy-set man in a sharp but bulging 3-piece suit, seemed to have given up and was sitting back patiently collecting what I'm conjecturing was a hefty hourly fee. He pulled out his phone and glanced at it. "We had met on several occasions, yes," Chip said. "Do you remember the last time you saw him?" "Oh, that would have been last night at around 10 p.m. when I stood over his dead, lifeless body." I couldn't see their faces, but the 2 interviewers' body language told me both had snapped to sudden attention. "What?" Deirdre's voice almost cracked when she spoke. "Oh, wait. My mistake," Chip said. "It was at the Christmas dinner at the Summit Club last month." His eyes darted to the others in the room, and then he burst out laughing. "Now you're paying attention," he said, and burst into another round of giggling. Deirdre breathed a deep and annoyed sigh and then continued. "Mr. Kavanaugh, I would request for the 3rd and final time that you approach this interview with the seriousness it deserves." "My client apologizes and is here to help in any way he can," Chip's attorney offered, taking his eyes off his phone long enough to rejoin the conversation. Chip nodded solemnly, and the attorney set the phone aside. "In our past interview, you said you had no interest in purchasing the copy of London After Midnight, which Tyler James had offered for sale." "Yes, thanks for remembering." "Did you put in a bid, and did Mr. Thomas outbid you?" Chip put up a hand in mock exhaustion. "One question at a time, please, one at a time." "Please answer the questions." Chip sat back in his chair, a slight smile returning to his face. No and no. Do you know for a fact that Mr. Thomas bid on the movie? He said he did, and I can't see why he would lie about it. Why are you just telling us this now? Chip shrugged, looking genuinely puzzled. Because you asked. And why did you not share this information with the homicide detectives when they first questioned you? Because they didn't ask me. They asked me if I bid on it, and I said no, because I didn't. It didn't interest me then, and it interests me less now. Deirdre and her husband exchanged a look. Mr. Kavanaugh, is there other information about the deaths of Tyler James and Clifford Thomas you possess and haven't shared with us? He gave her a long look and started to smirk, but apparently thought better of it. I have told you everything I know on the topics. I hope for your sake, Mr. Kavanaugh, you are correct on that point. That was essentially it for Chip Kavanaugh's interview. As the group exited the interview room, I spotted Sherry Lisbon standing impatiently in the hall outside the room, flanked by two intense-looking women. A small traffic jam formed as the two groups came head-to-head, but the first group went left and Sherry and her team went right, and a pileup was avoided. It might have been my imagination, but it really looked to me that both Chip Kavanaugh and Sherry Lisbon went out of their way not to look at or acknowledge each other as the two groups passed. I leaned forward in my chair to try to get a better look, but my view was blocked by the door frame and Sherry's legal team as they moved into the room. I remembered my odd encounter with her in the parking ramp the previous evening and considered what time it had taken place. I couldn't place it to the minute, but I reasoned that it was well before 8:30 p.m., as Quentin Moon's 75-minute show had started promptly at 7 p.m., and I had left just as it was concluding. For what it was worth, that meant I couldn't be used as an alibi for Sherry Lisbon. I took no small amount of relief in that fact. What was the name of the song you sang when we interviewed you? I'd almost forgotten Detective Wright was in the room with me. What? The song. What song? When Fred and I were interviewing you about that whole psychic murder thing a couple years back, right there in that interview room, you sang a song into the recorder while we went out of the room. The memory came back fast, and I couldn't help but smile. The song is called Mediocre Fred, I said. Mediocre Fred, Wright repeated. That's a funny name for a song. It's a funny song. You write it? His level of interest in this long-ago event really surprised me. No, it's a Smothers Brothers song. I think Lauren Paulson wrote it. Oh, I always thought you wrote it. Nope, wish I had. I didn't really wish I had, but I wouldn't have minded if I did. That thing really went viral. I mean, viral here at the station. That's what I heard. Deirdre had read me the riot act about it after the fact. Apparently, all police interview recordings are transcribed, and when the transcriptionist had gotten to that point in the interview, he or she found it so amusing, they made a copy of the recording and emailed it to select employees. And those employees sent it to others, and they sent it to others, and before they knew it, the email server was overloaded. Homicide Detective Fred Hutton was made the fool, and there was hell to pay. At the time, my relationship with my ex-wife's new husband was at best strained. We'd warmed to each other over the years, if only a little, and were I in the same situation today, I doubt I would sing the song while alone in the interview room. Well, certainly not the entire song. The tone of the second interview was different, but I doubt either Deirdre or Homicide Detective Fred Hutton would have characterized it as better. Sherry Lisbon's two attorneys made the following abundantly and immediately clear. Their client was here as a favor to the police. Her time was both valuable and limited, and they should understand in advance that she was unlikely to have anything of substance to add to their ongoing investigation. And, oh, did they mention her time was limited? There were only 4 chairs in the room, so one of the attorneys, the junior one, I assumed, stood behind the other while Sherry Lisbon sat back in her chair and languidly checked her makeup with a pocket mirror. Deirdre's first 3 questions elicited the identical reply from the senior attorney. Our client, Miss Lisbon, has already offered all the insight she has on that point. After this third response, the junior attorney produced a stack of papers and flipped it to a particular page. She handed the sheet to her superior, who glanced at it, made 3 quick check marks on the sheet, and then pushed it across the table to the 2 interviewers. Those questions have been answered, as you can see in this transcript of her previous interview with the Homicide Department, she added. While I was by now well aware the police recorded and transcribed their interviews, this was the first instance I'd seen where the interview subject had done that as well. Deirdre studied the transcript for a long moment with Homicide Detective Fred Hutton looking over her shoulder. While they reviewed the paperwork, the 2 attorneys looked through their notes. For her part, Sherry Lisbon finished touching up her makeup, closed her purse, and then stared across the room. It felt very much like she was staring right at me, although the gaze lacked any warmth or interest. I looked back at her, fascinated at how cold and blank a person's eyes could be. Boy, if I didn't know better, I said out of the corner of my mouth to Wright, I would swear she was looking directly at me. Yeah, you get that sometimes, Wright said with a patronizing tone in his voice I could have done without. But as long as this room is dark, the nature of the physics of the mirror make it impossible. I cut him off. But this room isn't dark, I said in a rushed whisper. You left the door open. Wright sat up suddenly in his chair. Oh, crap. I hadn't planned on sitting down. Maybe I should shut that, he added as he scrambled across the room and eliminated the light source by slamming the door shut. Maybe you should, I agreed, turning back to the glass. Sherry Lisbon was still staring at the same point, her expression unchanged by the sudden shift in the lighting in our room. She sighed dramatically and uncrossed her arms. Perhaps we can cut to the chase here, she said, her tone such that the other 4 people in the room immediately stopped what they were doing. She was turning on the CEO thing, and it clearly worked for her. The issue, as I see it, she continued, is one of motive, insofar as I don't have one. She let this sink in for a moment and then continued, as if to a child. Alibis and timelines aside, it's quite simple. I had no motive to kill Tyler James, and even less to kill Clifford Thomas. However, Deirdre began, but Sherry cut her off without taking a breath. As I have explained ad infinitum, I had no dealings with Mr. James on his most recent investment opportunity, and I certainly had no desire to buy the alleged movie from him or from Mr. Thomas. You can certainly sit here and say that, but how do we know that to be true? Deirdre had switched to her courtroom voice, which I knew well, but I wasn't convinced it would hold up against the sheer force of Sherry Lisbon's will. If you're working from the premise that something went awry in the sale of the movie, you can remove me from the list of suspects for one simple reason. I can assure you, if I wanted to buy it, I would have bought it, and that would have been the end of it, with perhaps a few tears but no bloodshed. You're saying, if you want it, you buy it, and that's that. Yes, dear, that's that. I could see Deirdre's shoulders tighten at the use of the word dear. Do you buy everything you want? Sherry Lisbon gave Deirdre her coldest smile, without exception. She then stood up and headed toward the door. No one made any move to stop her.
That was a fine read, Jim. Thank you.
I appreciate it. It's just reading. I've been doing it since the 8th grade.
Well, you do a good job of it. You know, I have very few regrets about this podcast.
I have none, just for the record. I have no
Okay,
regret.
good. Well, I have one, which is that we were unable to get Tommy Smothers on the show. to talk about Mediocre Fred and other things. I also tried to get Dickie on. They just were not interested. The song Mediocre Fred, which is kind of recapped in this chapter by Detective Wright, the credits on the album say it was written by Lauren Paulson, who I suspect was Pat Paulson.
Pat Pulse.
Who appeared on the Smothers Brothers. I can't find anything else on it. It was a favorite song as a child. It is still a favorite song, and I regret not being able to do that. However, on the other side of that scale, we got to meet both Tommy and Dickie Smothers. I've had my picture taken with very few celebrities. Kind of glad I didn't do one with Bill Cosby, because it just doesn't interest me. But having a picture taken with the Smothers Brothers, which hangs on a wall somewhere around here. It hangs on the wall. Oh, it's right up there.
Right above a New Yorker cartoon.
Yeah, I'll put that in the show notes if I remember it. Well, it's just a delight. We got to watch their sound check, which was either them just catching up or them doing a routine. It was hard to tell. They were both so funny on stage. The audience was I will say, a high percentage Republican audience. Tommy, of course, went far the other way. He started in the act to try some humor that way, and they didn't respond, and he just went fine and continued the act. He just wanted to entertain them, and that's what they did. What are your memories of that night?
You know, my strongest memory of that night, John, is you taking me to meet them. And I always am like you. I'm very shy about situations like that, and I don't want to bother people, especially before they're about to go on stage and try to, earn their keep by making a lot of people laugh. But you said, no, come meet him. And so we walked in and you introduced me to Dickie, and he could not have been nicer, but really all he did was shake my hand and say, "It's nice to meet you. I bet you're looking for Tommy, and he's over there." Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Not in a mean way, in a humble way.
In 50 years of, I
right.
realize that the one they want to
Probably
meet
not here to talk to me. You probably want to talk to Tommy.
Which was not true.
Which was not true. I was thrilled to meet them both. But then when we went across the hall, and we opened the door, there was Tommy standing in his tuxedo. And the first thing he said to us was, "Table for two?" And those are my memories of that meeting. The humility of Dickie and the sort of just razor sharp quickness of Tommy. They were both, in their own way, exactly what you'd want them to.
And I'll just add one memory to it, which I don't know if you were there for this part. After the show, we were kind of sitting around chatting with them and other people, and I was chatting with Tommy and his manager, and was asking him some political stuff because he was very political, and as was proven by the show being taken off the air because of its politics, and he started going in, and let me tell you, Tommy Smothers is a talker.
Yeah,
he is a talker. He went on for quite a long time. Fascinating, interesting, not boring at all. But I could tell his manager had kind of had enough, and so he got Tommy on his feet and started walking him to the elevator, and Tommy said, "Follow me." So I followed him, and they get in the elevator, and Tommy's still talking, and he's talking, and he's talking to me as the doors close. He's still talking. And that was the last I saw of him.
Yeah, I was not there for that. I was there for Table for Two.
Yeah.
It's very funny.
Very funny.
What a night. And so many fun experiences like that, thanks to you and the corporate work you hired me to do, and getting a chance to meet a lot of great people. I got to meet Jake Johansson, not on your watch, but he's on somebody else's. Because of the corporate work and the way you trained me, I was able to do that for others. And Jake Johansson is one of those guys who I should have saved him for one of our I Love It segments.
You still can.
Yeah, all right. I might. I'm going to stop talking. Stop talking. The elevator doors are closing.
They're totally closing. No, it was we met the great and the near great, and
Amen.
It was fun. All right. Well, that's enough of this lighthearted shilly-shally. Next time, we're going to do, I would say, probably chapter 18 of A Miser's Dream.
That makes sense.
Because this is episode 417. We're also going to revisit a snippet from a past chat. We've chatted with him a couple times with David Williamson about authenticity and creating a character, which is worth hearing again because he knows a thing or two about that.
He knows a thing or two of you could stop right there.
Yeah.
Anytime he speaks, a magician should listen because he is really insightful.
And we are I'm sure there are a handful of good things that came out of COVID. One of them was he got into teaching.
Yeah.
And you're not going to find a better or smarter teacher. And you can see him online. And it's cheap. It's cheap. So I'll have links and all that next time to get you into the David Williamson world. But until then, great seeing you, Jim.
Always great to see you, John. We will see all of you next time. Chapter 18 of The Miser's Dream. And as John mentioned, great snippet from our chat with David Williamson.
Take care, everybody.
Take care. Goodbye.
This has been Behind the Page, the Eli Marks podcast, with your hosts, John Gaspard and Jim Cunningham. Produced by Albertsbridge Books at Grass Lake Studios. Find this podcast and all the books in the Eli Marks series at elimarksmysteries.com. That's ELIMARKS Mysteries.com. And thanks for listening.